Keith Altman, for those of you who came in late, has a background in statistics. He is both a scientist and a lawyer. He will talk to you about the Zoloft defense, and explain to you about some of the other things that Bill was talking about. Keith Altman.
Before I get started with the main talk, I just wanted to show you some secret video I was able to obtain of Pfizer just before I came here. So this was right around Christmas time. So it'll work.
Oh, the weather outside is frightful, but the fire is so delightful. And since we've no place to go, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Man, there is no sign of stopping, and I've brought me some corn for popping. The lights are turned way down low. Let it snow, let it snow.
I have a nasty habit of trying to start with a little bit of humor, but frankly, this is not a topic that is humorous. Let me switch over to my talk.
What was that from?
That was Pfizer's review of certain information. Needless to say, I am not on Pfizer's Christmas card list. Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit today about adverse event data. But I want you to be thinking about one thing here, because this is really an application of uses of data in litigation or criminal cases that I can see applied to many different areas. Getting data, looking through data, looking for signals, patterns, things like that. Sometimes when you take a look at the data one way, you see one thing. When you take a look at it differently, you see something completely different. And the classic example I like to use of that is, who's seen Jurassic Park? Original movie. Probably knows it. It was the scene where they talk about they're so proud that they can track all the dinosaurs in the park. And we have 100 dinosaurs, and here's where the 100 dinosaurs are. And then Jeff Goldblum says, well, why don't you ask it how many dinosaurs there are in the park? And all of a sudden they find out there's 120 dinosaurs in the park because they're breeding. But their system was set up to only look for the 100 dinosaurs they thought that they had. And it's very much what we see here. People see what they expect to see. They look at the data a certain way. And sometimes you've got to take the bounds off the data and get under the covers and look and see things. And you may see something completely different than what you might expect. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the FDA adverse event data. And I'll talk some more. I've got a lot of details on the Topamax labeling change and the warnings. I was quite a bit involved in that whole situation taking place, and this is actually the subject of an amicus brief before the Supreme Court is going to hear a case on preemption next month, and all of this comes to light. So let's talk about a little bit about the adverse event database. One of the problems with drugs is in the clinical trials are typically not designed to detect rare adverse events. There's a rule of thumb called the rule of threes. What it says is, if you want to see an adverse event that occurs 1 in 1,000 patient years, you need 3,000 patient years of exposure in order to have a chance to see one. In order to detect that there's a difference, you need about 60,000 patient years of exposure. That's just not likely to happen in clinical trials. The typical clinical trial may have 1,000 or 1,500 patient years of exposure, and in some cases that have even far less than that. So the chance of seeing rare adverse events is just not going to happen. Because of this, the FDA requires companies, and it's not just the FDA, it's a worldwide, pharmacovigilance is a worldwide effect. Companies are required to do post-marketing safety surveillance, and much of what is learned about the safety of the drug comes out after the drug is on the market. That's to be expected, because now you go from having a few thousand patient years to millions of patient years of exposure, especially with these blockbuster drugs like Topamax. One of the funny things about Topamax is another drug called Neurontin. Some of you may have heard about their little bit of trouble Pfizer got into with Neurontin up in Boston when they pled guilty to felonies for over-promoting Neurontin, paid $450 million in fines. And I remember sitting there, we were taking the deposition of the guy who took the plea on behalf of Pfizer. And Mark Lanier, who's a wonderful attorney from Houston, as some of you may have heard from, was taking the deposition. He says to Mr. Teicher, what did Pfizer plead guilty to? And he says, well, we pled guilty to 2 misdemeanors for illegally promoting a drug, but because we were repeat offenders, they were upgraded to felonies. And I just, found that to be just shocking. One of the problems with these drugs is that these companies have done a masterful job of off-label promoting these drugs. Neurontin, they expected the lifetime sales of Neurontin to be $500 million. By the time it went generic, it was $12.5 billion in sales. When Pfizer bought Warner Lambert in 1990, they expected $1 million. I'm sorry, 2000, they expected about $1 billion worth of sales, and wound up getting 10 billion more, and they were very proud of it. So these drugs are very much in use. They do all kinds of interesting things, which we'll talk about. Now, the post-marketing safety surveillance is where you're going to learn about the safety of the drug going forward. And the regulations I cover that are 21 CFR 314.80 and 314.81. And you know it's a sick mind when somebody can quote those kind of regulations off the top of their head. But one of the key things to this, and I can show you lots of other areas where it can apply, it's all signal detection. It's all looking at the data to see if there is something there that's just not so obvious. Another great example I like to use, I'm a big example person, and I like to use movies. If you've ever seen The Hunt for Red October, anybody seen The Hunt for Red October? All right, there's the scene where he comes in with the tape recorder, and he plays, "Hey, Captain, listen to this." You play it, you listen to it. It doesn't sound like anything. And then he says, "Now let me play it for you 10 times speed," and all of a sudden you hear, doom, 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 and you know that it's something real. That's the same thing. Sometimes when you look at adverse event reports one at a time, you just don't see anything. But now you take a look at them overall and you see what's happening over time, what's the trend, what's going on here. Sometimes you can see things that just aren't really there. So the whole science of pharmacovigilance is how can we look at the safety of drugs and see what's going on. Now, at ADEs or adverse drug experiences, adverse event reports, MedWatch reports, they have lots of different names. But what can you tell from these MedWatch reports? The source of these reports, about 90% of them come from the manufacturers go to the FDA. Manufacturers are required to report MedWatch reports. Most of them anyway. One of the interesting anomalies is that there are effectively 3 conditions that are important with an adverse event report. Is the report from the United States, or did it come from outside the United States? Is the report serious and it has a very specific definition, or is it not serious? And is it in the label, or is it not in the label? Now, obviously, what's important when you're looking at adverse effects of drugs, especially trying to fit it into an involuntary intoxication defense, is it in the label or not? According to FDA regulations, once an adverse event is in the label, no foreign reports of that adverse event have to be submitted to the FDA at any time. In the United States, if it's a serious adverse event, it has to go to the FDA, whether what's called an expedited report is done in 15 days or once a year when they do their annual reports. But for foreign adverse events, they do not go to the FDA. So the whole concept that the FDA is a learned body is not necessarily true because they may not be getting a lot of the adverse event reports, even though the company knows about it. This is extremely important because if you really have a case where you really think you want an involuntary intoxication defense, you have to think about subpoenaing the manufacturer to try to get their records. Because the FDA database will not necessarily tell you the entire story. Now, with respect to the Vaughn case, I happen to have parallel litigation, civil litigation going on in New Jersey where I had all of their information and we were able to negotiate that as part of me working on the case. I was able to literally copy the hard drives that I had a couple million pages of documents and give them over to the defense in the Vaughn case, which is something that just generally wouldn't happen, but by this weird confluence, I had that stuff. I don't know how much of that was ever looked at or reviewed. I mean, I had taken, I don't know, 25 or not 25, probably 12 or 13 depositions in that case and can show that the company was aware no later than 2004 internally had concluded that Topamax increases the risk of suicide, yet they didn't show that little tidbit at the FDA, which I think is extremely important. In the Vaughn case, I would have liked to have brought that information out. So you have these adverse event reports that go to the FDA. Most of the time they come in from healthcare professionals. One of the biggest problems with adverse event reports is that doctors are under no obligation to submit them to the FDA or the manufacturer. They take time, and it's estimated that only between 1 and 10% of adverse event reports actually get reported to the FDA, which means you're really just seeing a small picture of what's going on. In a typical year these days, the FDA is receiving probably 400,000 adverse event reports per year, which means that there's likely to be somewhere between 4 million and 40 million adverse event reports a year. So this is once again just a picture. It's hard to, you know what, you're not going to use this data to say, aha, there were 46 completed suicides. That's not the whole story. It could be 460 to 4,600. What's important, that's just not how you use the adverse event data. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you use it because it's really important. There's a lot of cat fights over using adverse event data. one of the things you can see is, what are the kind of adverse events that you're seeing? Are you seeing psychiatric adverse events? If the drug is supposedly going to cause suicide and homicide, and Dr. Healy has certainly talked to you about that, suicide and homicide are really very closely related to one another, and the best predictor of suicidal behavior is homicidal behavior, the other way around. So when we talk suicide, that really works the same for homicide. Are you seeing the psychiatric events you expect to see? Because if you don't, something's wrong. I always said, if the clinical trials say you should see psychiatric events and you don't see any in the database, you've got a real problem. Looking at time trends. What's happening over time? Are we seeing patterns? Is something going on here? You can assess the adequacy of the label. One of the biggest problems, and this really ties in with involuntary intoxication, is the learned intermediary defense. I mean, we fight it every day when you deal with civil litigation over pharmaceutical adverse events. But the concept of a patient package insert, we argue, breaks the learned intermediary defense. When the FDA requires a patient package insert, what they're basically saying is, if you read the regulation, it's, oh God, I just quoted it, 41 CFR 2-something, 208. Yeah, 21 CFR 208. The FDA basically has to find that in order for a patient package insert is required when it is necessary to ensure patient safety or protect patient safety. And for two reasons. Number one, to assist the patient in deciding with the doctor as to whether the drug's appropriate for their use. And that's really important, because what's disgusting about a lot of these cases, when you really raise one of these issues, watch out for the pharmaceutical company sitting in the courtroom helping the prosecution in the Pittman case. Pfizer wrote a document called The Prosecutor's Guide to Defeating Involuntary Intoxication Defense, and was literally sitting there in the courtroom helping the prosecution. I helped on a case, it was a basic assault case, but there was Paxil withdrawal involved in Nassau County in New York. Pfizer had gone out and paid $50,000 to an expert on behalf for the prosecution. Went out and paid for that bill themselves and was sitting in the courtroom with their attorneys helping the prosecution try that case. I mean, this is just on a basic assault case. He was claiming involuntary intoxication. Unfortunately, in New York, there is no involuntary intoxication defense, so it got to be a little bit of a problem. But it's really insane that they're sitting there helping. So you have this patient package insert. So they're going to argue, if you raise these defenses, well, if the doctor was learned, it was in the label, that's good enough. Well, the FDA says not so. The FDA says, especially with this patient package insert, it's there because it is a collaborative decision between the patient and the doctor to decide whether that drug is appropriate. It is not just simply the doctor deciding. That's really important if they try to say, well, we didn't have to warn the patient, we didn't have to tell them. Number two, and maybe more important, is that the patient package insert also contains guidance to the patients of what to look for if an adverse event is beginning to happen. The kind of symptomology that Bill was talking about before, if you see these symptoms, go see your doctor. That's really important. So it really does matter what they tell or didn't tell the patient. Signals. One of the things that you're looking for is, are there signals of a pattern in the database? Now I can tell you, it's a longer story than this seminar will allow, but one of the bases for the Topamax labeling change is that my law firm, and me particularly, we had decided to run some ads for a drug called Innocence, where we had a client who was bipolar who tried to commit suicide. We ran some commercials, and we got 30,000 phone calls in the first 8 weeks that we ran commercials, and people said they had been harmed by this drug in terms of suicides, attempted suicide, violent behavior. We had something like 150 suicides. The FDA database only had about 75. And so we called the FDA and said, hey, look, you guys got a problem here. We got 75, we got 150 on our own. We'll make all the data available to you. And the FDA said, you guys have the most important set of adverse event data associated with this drug in the world. We said to them, great, come up, we'll anonymize it, we'll make it all available to you, we'll ask any questions you want to any of these people, and we'll do whatever we can do from a scientific perspective. The FDA did the middle of the donut. They did absolutely nothing. Well, one of the reasons that we had decided to advertise is because I looked at the FDA database, and in the first 5 years, from 97 to 2002, Pfizer had reported 8 reports of suicide to the FDA. In the first half, that's 1.6 per year. In the first half of 2003, they reported 17. That's 34 per year. There's a 20-fold reporting rate increase of suicides. That is a signal. That's not just a signal, that's a nuclear bomb going on. And so, ignoring the data that we had, I sent a citizens petition to the FDA just based upon what was in their own database and said, you guys need to change the label. There's no warning for completed suicide in this label. And I submitted the citizens petition based on that data in March of 2011. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, I'll come back to some of this. March of 2005, we called them up and said, hey, you guys never did anything. And so we wound up sending 258 suicide MedWatch reports to the FDA with death certificates attached. We figured we'll get the point across. It wasn't the preferred way to do things because it kind of corrupts the database to some degree, but we did it, we sent it in, and the FDA immediately responded and said, in part because of your concerns, we have decided to investigate all the anticonvulsant manufacturers to see if there's any relationship between suicide. And then in January 2008, the FDA comes out with an alert that says there is an increased risk. They have an advisory committee in July of 2008. And in December of 2008, the FDA decides that the label does need to be changed. So the bottom line is adverse events do matter, they do count, and they do show some things. Now, de-challenge, re-challenge. This is some of the most important evidence that you might come across. Everybody says, what's de-challenge, what's re-challenge? Okay. De-challenge is, I give somebody a drug to get an adverse effect. I take the drug away, and the adverse effect gets better, or is eliminated. Then I give them the drug, that's a de-challenge. Then I give them the drug again, and the adverse event comes back, that's a re-challenge. That's some of the strongest evidence, and I always like this analogy because you got to try to explain this to a jury. Well, it's the Christmas tree analogy. We've all done it, even the Jewish people like me. You set up the Christmas tree, you plug in the Christmas lights, and the things don't go on. And you say, man, I can't believe they didn't go on. So what do we start doing? We start unscrewing each of the bulbs until all of a sudden the lights come on, and we say, aha! Then we screw the bulb back in, and the lights go out. Then we screw the bulb out again, the lights go on, and we say, that's it, that's the bulb, that's the problem. Well, that's de-challenge, re-challenge. Everybody would pretty much, when you see that kind of thing, that pretty much convinces you that it's that light bulb that's causing the problem. Well, the re-challenge in a drug situation is like that. It's not determinative, it's not the only evidence, but it's very strong evidence. And Dr. Huey, who finally made it here, he's going to certainly talk about it's a synthesis of the available evidence. It's no one thing that tells the whole story. It's taking the adverse event data, the clinical trial data, the post-marketing studies that come out, de-challenge and re-challenge reports, and it's a pattern, it's a consistency. It's like, I used the bowl of fruit analogy, and this is really important from a Daubert or a Fry perspective, depending on where you are. You're going to have this thing, you're going to make an argument that the drug has the capacity to induce general causation. And the defendant's going to come back and say, well, this thing over here, that's grapes, and over here we have some oranges, and this is apples and pineapples. You know, all these little things there, and they don't go together. That's not really the question. The question is, do you have a bowl of fruit? That's really what it is. It's almost like a meta-analysis, but it's not like one that you can do with numbers. It is a collective synthesis of the information, and that's really what Dr. Huey does when he looks at all the available information. Okay, the FDA, very fortunately and graciously, makes the adverse event data available to the general public. And it is a fundamental component of pharmacovigilance of any drug company in the world to get the FDA adverse event database. It is the price of a middle of a donut. You can go on their website, you can download it for free. That doesn't mean you don't have to put quite a bit of time into it. I estimate over the last, I've been working with the data now for 15 years, and I probably have about 10,000 hours invested in working with the FDA data. So there's a lot of time and effort that goes into working with those databases and building those databases. But I don't make $1 billion a year, or $5 billion, or $10 billion a year like the pharmaceutical companies. And I use myself kind of as a yardstick. I'm a cart carrying nothing, a little bit of ingenuity, pretty good with data, and a cheap $700 laptop. And if I can do it with the FDA database and a pharmaceutical company that's got, any pharmaceutical company generally has a bigger safety surveillance department than the entire FDA's safety surveillance department, who's responsible for monitoring 5,000 some odd drugs. Most companies, 150 people. The FDA doesn't have 150 people looking at drug safety. So if one guy with a database can do it, all other companies can do it. Now the FDA data, now it used to be called the AERS. Well, first it was called SRS until '97, Spontaneous Reporting System. Then they came up with AIRS, Adverse Event Reporting System. Now it's FAIRS. FDA adverse event reporting system. I'm going to keep changing the lingo just to confuse everybody. The data comes out every quarter. They're about 6 months behind. And you can go on the FDA website, if you look up errors, you'll see you'll find it in this quarterly data extract. You can just download it. If you know what to do with it, God bless, you can have it. The data goes back to 1969. I have the data all the way back that far, and so I can do analyses that goes along with that. There's a standard medical dictionary. This is extremely important when looking at adverse events. There is it used to be called CoSTAR. There were about 1,200 different terms that could be used to describe an adverse event, and amazingly, until 1997, there was no term for completed suicide. There was only a term for suicide attempt, so you had to look for a suicide attempt with a death was how you coded a completed suicide. In 97, they went to a dictionary called MEDRA, which has about 17,000 terms, and it's hierarchical. So you have a bunch of terms, and they accumulate up to bigger level terms, and there's 4 different levels, essentially, that can do that. But what's important about that is that when you are looking for the safety issues for certain drugs, the fact that you can go across different companies and different drugs becomes very important that they use some kind of standardization. So for example, the SSRIs. If you were looking at an SSRI, Zoloft, Paxil, Prozac, Effexor arguably, Luvox, if you look at these drugs, it makes sense to look at the adverse event data for all of the class of drugs, because if it's happening to Zoloft, well, it's relevant to Prozac and the other way around. And I'm going to show you some analyses that were done looking at that kind of stuff. These days, most manufacturers report electronically. They just submit data to the FDA in an electronic file. It gets loaded up. It wasn't always that way. The FDA used to hand enter the stuff into the database, and it would be interesting to compare the differences between, I'd have the company's internal database, and then I would have the FDA database, and I could see the difference of how the company coded the reports and how the FDA coded the reports, and very creative. And Dr. Hilliard talked about this. They would play games with calling certain things emotional lability, which, when it really was, suicide attempt, and those issues have come up, and play all kinds of things. So the moral of that story is you have to be a little bit careful when you look at the adverse events. You can't just be narrow and say, I just want to look at completed suicide reports. Even for a homicide case, you're going to want to look at homicidal ideation. You're going to want to look at suicide, anxiety, aggression. There are various different terms that you would want to look at. There's a lot of considerations when you do the database. I think this was provided to you. I'm not going to really go through this, but this is a paper that I presented at the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology conference. And I talk about a lot of the different things you have to look at with this database. You have to be careful. You can't just take the raw data, slap it up, and say, aha, here I go, because there are duplicate reports in there. There are reports that are revised over time. You have to be careful of all of those things. If you're going to use this kind of data, you've got to go into rifle bullets. The defendants are going to, the other way around, the prosecution is going to go crazy when you start trying to bring this data in, which means you've got to be very precise and really on your game with it. So you can't just throw the data up indiscriminately, because it's going to come back to haunt you. Now, there's a lot of different reporting biases that are important that you take into account when you look at this. One's called the Weber effect. When a new drug comes on the market, you get a lot of stimulated reporting because it's a new drug. But it's still important to look at that stuff. There are regulatory biases, whether there are rules where they have to send reports, or like companies, once it's in the label, no foreign reports go in, so the regulations can influence what you see in the database. Resource bias. Before the FDA took electronic reporting, they entered in all the serious reports, but the non-serious reports, they only typed in if they had time. So not all the non-serious reports are there because they just didn't have the resources to put it in. And that creates an enormous bias in the signal detection that I'm going to show you an example of in a minute, where the FDA can miss signals. So one of the things that will be important is if the prosecution is going to get up and argue, the FDA, if there's anything there, the FDA would have said something about it. You can't go by that. Just because the FDA didn't say anything about it doesn't mean anything at all. Now, this is where we start to get into the battles. How do you get adverse event data in? They're going to argue that it's hearsay. In the Pittman trial, Your Honor, it's hearsay, it's double hearsay, it's triple hearsay. They're going to come up with anything and everything that they can. The reality is this is the records of a regularly conducted activity of a governmental agency. It's the records of a regularly conducted activity of a pharmaceutical company. They're required to do these things. Now, typically in a civil litigation, we're using adverse event data for notice. and to support causation. You're a little different perspective here because you're trying to show that there is a possibility, a reasonable possibility that the drug could have caused your client to commit these acts. And so you're going a little bit further than we typically go. You need to be careful of how you use the data, but at least it is certainly noticed, and it can certainly go to the labeling and the warnings, and I think that's still relevant in the criminal context. Did the label accurately reflect what the company knew about the adverse effects of the drug at the time? And be careful. I don't like the concept, and we've all seen this. Had I known that about the drug, I never would have taken that drug. That's not realistic, and it's not even what you need to do. All you got to do is get your client to say, had I known about the risk of the drug at the time, I would have done something differently. I would have monitored. I would have told my family why, I'm taking this drug. It may cause these kinds of things. If you see these things, I mean, you got to tell me. You got to, maybe I won't even realize it, but you got to go to my doctor. You got to tell me. You got to get me involved. It's a lower threshold, and it's realistic. I hate these, all of you know we're behind the 8 ball in the voluntary intoxication defense in the first place. But we've got to be reasonable with the jury. I think it's so much easier to convince a jury, I would have told my family to help me monitor it, than to say I never would have done it in the first place. I mean, if the drug provided you some relief, it's a little hard to say, I would have taken it because of this rare risk. The other thing that they'll come up with, 97 billion people use this drug and nobody had this effect. How is that relevant? The only relevance is, did it cause my client to have this adverse effect? The number of people that it didn't lead to just doesn't matter. Now, once again, the most important thing with the adverse event data, you have to put it into context. If you want to use the adverse event data to establish a causal relationship, Dr. Hilly will tell you, it's almost impossible on its own to establish a causal relationship. You really do need more. You need some trials. You need something that's going on. There's also an interesting concept in statistics. A lot of times you'll hear that a clinical trial was done and it failed to detect an increased risk, therefore there is none. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. This is the classic result. Let's see. Yeah. I don't know if you can read that, but that's a typical statistical result that you see more often than not when you're dealing with drugs. And it says the relative risk is 1.3, and the confidence interval is 0.9 and 2.2. The confidence interval means that the true relative risk is likely to be somewhere in there. This is statistics. It's not an exact or precise science. There's random error. There's all kinds of things. Those results are inconclusive as to whether there is an increased risk. But they are not. They do not represent that there is no increased risk. And typically you will see the prosecution come in, point to a result like that. See, there's nothing there. How many times do you see it? Nothing is further from the truth. All this is inconclusive. I took a deposition in one of the cases, and then I said, okay. And it was a result similar to that. I said, based on those data, can you conclude that there is an increased risk? I said, no. I said, can you conclude that there is a decreased risk? I said, no. I said, can you conclude that the risk is exactly 1.00 to an infinite precision, that they're exactly the same? I said, no. And I said, now there's only 3 possibilities, right? Increased risk, decreased risk, or it's the same? And they said, yeah, well, the risk can go from 0 to infinity, so I guess that's the same thing. I said, okay. So you'd agree that those results are inconclusive as to whether there's an increased risk? No, I wouldn't agree with that. I said, do you know what the word inconclusive means? And I says, yeah, when you can't tell the difference. I said, okay, can you tell whether that's an increased risk? No. Can you tell whether it's a decreased risk? No. Can you tell that the risk is 1.0? No. So you'd agree that it's inconclusive? No, I wouldn't agree with that. And that's useful cross-examination, because assuredly, Dr. Healy knows him. A guy like Douglas Jacobs is the famous famous prosecution / defense witness in a civil case that they put on, and he will testify to those kind of things, that there is no increased risk because the results are not statistically significant. It's just not true. One of the things I suggest you all should read, if you haven't, is the Manual for Scientific Evidence. Is available on the Federal Judicial Center website. And it really is a very, very good introduction from a legal perspective to statistical significance and risk and things like that. So the testifying expert needs to be very, very careful. Now, Dr. Healy and I have worked a lot of times where he'll tell me what he's looking for, and I'll go and I'll prepare the data to fit the mold of what it is that he's looking for. I don't mean the mold like I cook the data, but he'll tell me I want to see these particular adverse events, I want to know how many there are over time, and I'll prepare the data for him, and then he can take that. He doesn't have to worry about the nuts and bolts of counting and things like that, which is mostly what it is, and he can just render his opinions. We've done that several times, and I think that was very effective. Okay, so one of the things that's really important too, as I said, you have to look beyond the raw data. It's one thing to get, here's all the 27,000 Zoloft adverse event reports, and it's probably more than that. And if you take the SSRIs as a whole, I think there's something like 95,000 adverse event reports in the FDA database. It's a lot of data. But you need to look at, you've got to do something with the data. Now, one of the things for signal detection, I do this a lot, it's kind of fundamental, is to look at, if I'm going to try to see, is this drug creating a problem, I look at what's the percentage of a certain kind of percentage of the reports for an adverse event for the drug I'm interested in versus some other comparator drugs. Because that'll kind of give you an idea of whether there's something different. And it's called proportional reporting rate analysis. And you all know all about this, you just don't know you know. And I always use the property tax example. It's another one of these famous examples. Two guys are arguing over. One guy says, man, I got to pay $5,000 a year in property taxes. And the other guy says, what are you complaining about? I got to pay $10,000 a year in property taxes. And the first guy says, yeah, but my house is worth $100,000, so I'm paying 5%. And your house is worth $1 million, and you're only paying 1%. So just the raw numbers, 5,000 versus 10,000, doesn't tell you the story. But if you look at 1% of the value versus 5% of the value, that tells you something different. And that's kind of what proportional reporting is. Now, the FDA has got a major flaw in its signal detection algorithm. The FDA has implemented this elaborate signal detection strategy. They come out with these quarterly signal detection reports of what they think are new signals. And they're missing all the signals in new drugs because of the way they look at, they include non-serious adverse event reports. So I'll show you a great example of what you can see and why the FDA's statements may not mean anything. This is, and hopefully you can see this reasonably well. There's a drug called, these are diabetic drugs, and this is an adverse event called pancreatitis. Now what you can see is this is the percentage of the adverse event reports for various different diabetes drugs that are associated with pancreatitis. And you can see how they evolve over time. And you look at it, you really don't see anything kind of remarkable here. Some are higher than others. This over here is a new drug. It's called Byetta. And when you look at it, certainly, this is just a spike because the data was new. And there was a bunch of notoriety that came in over here, so that's really corrupted data. But it's good because you should see it. And the problem is this is looking at all reports. The only problem is that Byetta sent 95% of the reports that Byetta sent in are non-serious. For all the other drugs, it's about 20%. Pancreatitis is a serious adverse event. So what it's doing is, it's making it, since so many of the reports are non-serious in nature, it's making its percentage much lower than it might have otherwise been. Well, look what happens if you get rid of the non-serious events. Now you see that Byetta sticks out like a sore thumb all by itself above everybody else. So this is a great example of one of the things that we fundamentally want to look at. If you were looking at psychiatric adverse events of a drug, you would want to compare one drug versus another drug. You'd want to make sure that you're talking apples and apples, not apples and oranges, because you can hide the signals. Now, the way the FDA does their signal detection reports, they would have seen the first picture. The way I do it, you see the second picture. And I actually took the deposition of the guy who developed this system that the FDA uses, and I asked him, did you ever look at what was the effect of leaving these non-serious adverse events? And he said, no, I never looked at it. And that's why the FDA is missing all kinds of signals that could be very important. Now, we talked a little bit about, let's take a look at, this is an analysis that's a little more typical of SSRI events and looking at suicide and looking at homicide reports. And I told you before, this is the number of reports. Not every report, the manufacturer decides which drugs are considered suspect, and typically if the manufacturer gets the report, their drug is suspect. But they'll also list all the other drugs that were involved. They're not considered suspect. So one of the things you typically want to do is only look at suspect reports. And a lot of times, because of differential reporting of non-serious events, you only want to look at serious suspect reports. So this is kind of a typical analysis where we want to look at the SSRIs. These are the number of reports that came in, suspect, serious suspect, at a particular point in time, June 30th. Now you can see December 31st, 2003, and it's increasing is kind of what you would expect. And now looking at 2004, so we're looking at time trends. Now we've got 109,000 reports. And now we start looking at suicidal events. And this is where the rubber meets the road, where you can start showing that particular kinds of drugs or particular drugs within a class are showing adverse effects that exceed everybody else. And this is as of 2001. Then we get to 2003. And we get to 2004. And then the key reports are the de-challenge, re-challenge reports. And how many of those do you have? Those are very precious. They're few and far between. Dr. Haley will talk to you about how many times do you, especially at a clinical trial, how often do you see a re-challenge report in a clinical trial?
Not all.
If you find one in a clinical trial, it's like, it can be all but determinative. I mean, that is a controlled environment. They have a very difficult time dismissing a re-challenge report for a clinical trial. And there are some of those. So the details of this is not important, but this is the kind of way of presenting the data that you want to do it as part of if you're going to do an involuntary intoxication defense. You're going to want to start doing these kinds of charts. And then you can do a comparison between drugs. This is just another example of where you can take a drug against a drug known to be associated with the adverse event. And this is looking at congenital defects. And the two drugs here, one is Accutane, which is the blue, which is one of the most teratogenic drugs out there. That you have been on it or have a child that's on it. If you're a female, you have to sign. You have to go for monthly pregnancy tests. You have to sign all kinds of documents and all this stuff to not get pregnant on it because it's almost an assured thing. If you get pregnant while taking Accutane, you will have a child with birth defects. Depakote, though, on the other hand, is an anticonvulsant and was routinely given to pregnant women. When you look at the kind of adverse events that you're seeing, Depakote looks a lot like Accutane. And when I showed this to Abbott's local shop, I showed it to their director of pharmacovigilance. He all but used over the table to strangle him. He was not abused. All right, so I'll talk to you about a couple of real-world examples, one of which I talked about was the Neurontin, but let's talk a little bit about Phenergan. Phenergan's an important one. It actually came up in that Hampson case that I was talking about, that simple assault case. The prosecution, I gotta get that straight. The prosecution was arguing adverse event reports are unimportant. They mean nothing. The companies are just obligated to send it in. They don't get used for anything. Well, that's just not true. I don't know if any of you heard of the Wyeth versus Levine case, but that case was in 2009, and that was the case that went to the Supreme Court where it was argued that effectively all pharmaceutical civil cases should be preempted. The Supreme Court came down and said, no, they're not preempted. You have to show that the FDA would have rejected the change, and Phenergan was the drug associated with that. It's a woman named Levine, and she lost most of her arm. She was a violinist, a world-class violinist, and Phenergan is like an anti-nausea drug, and they don't know if it was given to her extravasated, but basically Phenergan's an acid. You take an acid, you inject it in. If you take an acid and you inject it in your arm, you're going to do some serious damage. Probably going to lose an arm. Well, that's what Phenergan is. If you get it under the skin, or you extravasate, which means you go through the vein and you puncture the vein, or you put it into an artery, you pretty much can kiss fingers, your hand, maybe your whole arm and body. After the case was decided, I had actually worked on one of the amicus briefs for that, where I had analyzed the data, and it was amazing because if you took a look at the Phenergan data, and I'll bring it up. What you found is that compared to all the other drugs, I'll try to zoom in on this. I don't know how well you can read that. I'll try to read you. But compared to all the other drugs used for intravenous administration, for gangrene, the reporting rate increase was 18.6. So it had 18.6 times the reporting rate. For amputation, it was 32 times the reporting rate. And in fact, virtually all of the amputation, if you looked at just the pure numbers, if you look at all the numbers of amputations, Infliximab, which is Remicade, is another injected drug. Is number one. It's probably got 100 times the usage of promethazine, but promethazine came in number two. But what was also interesting is that if you took a look at all the imputation reports for promethazine, it can be done in two ways, intravenously or intramuscularly. 100% of the reports were intravenous or intraarterial administration. It was not happening intramuscularly. And the warning was not discouraging the use of intravenous or intraarterial administration. This was presented in August of 2009 at the ISB conference. 3 weeks after that, and the FDA was there, they also copies of the poster, and 3 weeks after that, the FDA came out for the labeling change. And this is very important, and I believe I put this on the materials, but what's very important here. This action is based on FDA's analysis of post-marketed reports of severe tissue injury, which means only based upon adverse event reports, nothing else, no clinical trial data, no nothing. So adverse event, if the FDA can go and change a label based on adverse event reports, that makes the adverse event reports relevant in the appropriate context. I think that's a very important example. Neurontin, we talked a little bit more about Neurontin, and as I said, I mean, here's the letter. Here's the letter from the FDA, which was just pretty shocking to my boss. What was unbelievable is we sent them, we told them we had the data, and here's the FDA saying, for these reasons, we urge you to engage the services of an expert to help you analyze and interpret this data. So in other words, we tell the FDA about all these suicide reports, and it was our job to review the data, not the FDA's data. But more importantly, we would also like you to know that in part because of the concerns you have raised, we have asked the sponsors of all drugs approved to treat epilepsy to reanalyze the controlled trials databases to examine the question of drug-induced suicide and/or suicidality. So it does make a difference. January 2008, they came out with the alert, and then by December of 2008, the FDA decided to make the change. So the point, and that's the evolution now. If you listen to any of the Topamax, we don't hear Topamax commercials, but any of the Lyrica commercials that you see all the time on TV, the suicide warning is because of that. And the other half of that was Topamax. Was the Topamax had raised some minor issues, but not in the same way. Now, Pittman was another example, and you all probably know some of the history of that. Dr. Healy was involved in that. We both testified there. He killed his grandparents when he was 12. He was tried as an adult. He took Zoloft prior to the murders. If you take a look at the medication guide that came out after he had committed the crimes, and you look at watch out for the following symptoms, just like in the Vaughn case, you see the exact same information, the exact same symptoms that he was exhibiting in the couple of days before. Didn't he try to strangle, didn't he try to choke one of the kids on the bus or something like that? He got very aggressive and violent just in like 2 days. I mean, uncharacteristically, in like 2 days before the murders, he started exhibiting all of this escalation of violent behavior. And then didn't they get the labeling changed back after that? During the middle of the trial, didn't they work to get the labeling change? But he knows that Pfizer was sitting there in the courtroom, and it was just unbelievable. Now, this is where sometimes individual reports are important. Now, this is an extract from the FDA data. These are individual reports. I'll try to zoom in so that you can see it. But one of the ones that I thought was incredibly important, so Dr. Healy, and this was also important in the Vaughn case, was here is a homicidal ideation report in a 21-year-old kid that had de-challenge and re-challenge. So this is somebody who took Zoloft, became homicidal, got taken off the drug, it abated, got put back on the drug, became homicidal again. That's pretty relevant to the question of whether these drugs can be associated with homicidal behavior. So, this is some of the stronger evidence. If you ask a pharmacovigilance person, in the scheme of, we're not talking about clinical trials here, but if you talk about taking a look at, these are called case reports, they're individual reports, and you start ranking them in terms of importance. The only thing that's more powerful than a de-challenge, re-challenge report is one where you give somebody a drug and 10 seconds later they drop dead on the floor. It's a pretty good bet that you wouldn't want to take that drug. But short of that, short of immediate anaphylaxis, This is about as strong a report as you can get. So taking this along with other data would be very, 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 very strong evidence. And this is certainly available to the company because it came from the company. All right, I think that's it. I probably bombarded you with a lot of stuff, but beforehand, so I just want to show the application to other areas where this can be extremely important. Another case I was involved in was, these are not criminal cases, but where there was a tire manufacturer. And we were able to show through the tire data that there were certain lots of tires that had these major problems. And we were able to track down a manufacturing defect based upon that. So if your client, you could take arrest records. You could find patterns in arrest records over time that could be relevant to your case. Financial transactions is another great case. Another case I was working in is a leasing company. The leasing company leases out credit card processing equipment to people. And they'll get you to lease this $200 piece of equipment for $50 a month for 48 months. You pay them like $2,400. The only problem is that they'll charge you personal property taxes. And what they do is this $200 piece of equipment, they know it's worth $200. They'll charge you personal property tax based on the $2,400, and then they'll remit it to the taxing authority based on $200. They keep the difference, which winds up being a lot of money. The point being is that by taking a look at these databases, sometimes you can see data or patterns that can support your client's case. Timing. I worked on a case where we got toll booth data, and we were able to look at the cars going through the toll booths, and we were able to correlate a timeline of certain events that happened by looking at the toll booth data, or certain patterns and things like that. We could, in another case, we were able to show the time between the toll booths for the toll tag was shorter than he could have driven at the speed limit. I said you can show the only way that could happen if the person was speeding at the time. So there's just, we talk about adverse event data here. What I hope to stimulate is you're thinking that there's all kinds of data out there available to you from the other side. You got to work to get it, and you got to show how it can fit into the context. So I probably totally overwhelmed you with a bunch of adverse events. I'd be happy to answer any questions now, later, whatever you want.
Is there any distinction in the data between brand name drugs and generic versions of the drugs?
Can you repeat for the benefit of
Sure.
the tape?
The question was, is there any distinction between brand name drugs and generic drugs? Typically when I run a search for the data associated with a particular drug, I always run the generic. And I always run the generic and the brand name. Most of the brand name, but the generics typically would use the chemical substance. So if you were looking at Phenergan, they would put it under promethazine. But occasionally you have to go to something called the Orange Book. The Orange Book lists all drugs that are currently approved and what their trade name and generic name is, and you can use that to help you figure out what are the names, depending on the level that you have to go to. You bring up an interesting thing that I should also mention. One of the real problems, and this is this whole crazy thing, I guess it'll be 2 years ago, Supreme Court came out with an opinion that effectively said you can't bring a lawsuit against a generic manufacturer because they're not allowed to change the label. Now, once a drug goes generic, 90% of the prescriptions are for the generic version, not the innovator. And typically, although only about 20% of the adverse event reports in the FDA database are the generic version. So the people who have the vast bulk of the prescriptions out there are not the ones who are sending in the reports. It's just the innovator, but it gets worse. Because the typical generic manufacturer, if they only get 5 adverse event reports for that drug in a year, those are the only 5 reports they look at. There could be 500 others between the other generic manufacturers plus the innovator that pay no attention to any of that kind of stuff. Now, we just found out that the FDA is talking about requiring generic manufacturers that they can change the label just like the innovator, and that's going to kind of turn the world a little bit on its head. So.
Is there any indication of SSRI use in multiple victim shooting cases?
Well, there are homicide reports. So,
but I mean, these 20, 30 cases that we've been seeing in the news.
I thought that one of the Columbine kids was on Uvox, if I remember right.
And Lori Down.
Lori Gann for sure, yeah.
Yeah, Lori Down.
But any of the more recent ones, the Colorado or?
Don't know, haven't looked at that.
One of those, it's an issue that I'll pick up, Keith, so if you want to wait till the next talk.
I'm sorry?
There you go.
It's an issue that I will pick up at the next talk.
I'll stay.
Yeah, I'm just a numbers guy. He's the guy who knows how to interpret. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks for the time today, and I'll turn it over to Dr.